Hashem, today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Samachal of Zevachim 61. Today's daf is dedicated to a refuah shlema for all the chayalim who are wounded, and we are going to we're going to study on the bottom of Samachal Beis, 8 lines from the bottom. The Gemara has said in yesterday's daf that Abaye said that if the altar was damaged, then not only is the mincha unable to be in, and not only is the kachi kachim unable to be in, but even the kachi kalim, like the shlomim, the bechor, also that's unable to be in. It's puzzle. So when this teaching was said in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, so says our Gemara, Kisolik Rava, when Rava went up to Eretz Yisrael, Amar Shemaita, he said his teaching of Abaye Kamei, Rabbi Yirmiyah. He said in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Yirmiyah said, Amar Bavlai Tipshai, these foolish Babylonians, Am told the Yasvi Ba'ara Chashucha, because they dwell in a land of darkness, Amri Shmaita de Mechashka. They're saying a teaching that's dark, meaning it's not correct. Ushmilahu didn't they hear, or didn't Abaye hear Haditanya, that there's a brisa, and when we learn this brisa, we're going to see that actually kachi kalam is not disqualified if the altar is damaged. And the way this comes out is because there's a contradiction between two brisos. And the way Rabbi Yirmiyah is miyashev the brisos is by saying that kachi kalam is not prohibited if the mizbeach is damaged. Because what does the first brisa say? The first brisa says, the Tanya, b'shas tiluk masos kachim nifsalan. When the Mishkan would be traveling, the kache, Rashi says here, we're talking about kache, and we'll see that from the end, become disqualified. But still, even though the Mishkan is traveling, the camps retain their form, and the Zav and the Mitzorah are sent out from the camp. So we see from here that it has the kedusha of the azar, and it still has the kedusha of the courtyard, but it's disqualified. Why is it disqualified? Because the mizbeach is not there anymore. So it's like the mizbeach is damaged. But then there's a contradictory brisa. Vitanya idach, a second brisa says, Bishnei mekomos kachim nechom, that there are two places in which the kachim can be eaten. Meaning to say, one place is when the mizbeach is there, and the other place must be when the Mishkan traveled, and wherever they are, they could eat it, even though the Mizbeach is not there. And so we see from here that even though the Mizbeach has damaged, you could still eat from it. So there's two contradictions. And so how do we explain this? There's a contradictory law. So how do we explain this contradiction? My lab, Havikachi Kachim, Havikachi Kalam. The brisa that says that the first brisa, which says that the kachim is disqualified, that's referring to kachim types of offerings. But the brisa that says that you can eat it, shnei mekomos, that's referring to kachim kalam, and so therefore this is against the teaching of Abaye. So the Gemara is going to bring alternative ways of resolving this contradiction. Amar Ravina idi v'kachim kalam. Ravina says no. Both brisos, the one that says it's disqualified, is also talking about kachi kalam. If that's the case, why is it disqualified? Well, kasha, it's not difficult because it's just a contradiction between two different opinions. The brisa that says that it's disqualified, that's the position of Rabbi Shmuel, who drew a comparison from dam to basar by a bechor, and he says it's disqualified. And the brisa that says it's permitted, that's Rabbanan. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbanan. We're on top of Samach Aleph Amid Aleph. Alternatively, or alternatively, the second brisa that says it's permitted, that's not referring to kachi kalam, that's referring to kachi kachim. And if that's the case, why is it permitted in the second brisa? My bishnei mekomos. What does it mean when there are two places where the kachim are able to be in? One is kodim sheyamdu levim es mishkan. Rashi says this means really basically the regular status that not before the Levites set up the Mishkan, but rather it means after the Levites set up the Mishkan, and before they take it down. And so Rashi says, it's not specifically before the Levites established a Mishkan. First of all, because they never had the altar there before the curtains, so there wouldn't be the first would be the curtain, and then would be altar. And he goes through the format of which they did it. So really what we're talking about is that one is Ba'oda Mishkan Natoi Kamishpato. So the first case we're talking about is where the Mishkan is set up properly. So then you could, of course, partake of it. And the other one is after they took down the beams and the curtains around the Mishkan and the altar is still there. So then you could still eat from the Mishkan. And that's what Rashi says. And after the Levites took down the Mishkan, we're in the top of 61b. So they're both talking about Kachim in the Brisa, and so therefore we're saying in those cases it's permitted, but in the other cases it would be prohibited, and it doesn't say anything about Kachim Kalam. Mao the Tema, meaning to say, what would you have thought? Why would you have thought that when you take down the curtains and the altar is still there, that it would be prohibited? You might have thought, if so, it will be Yotze, that since you took down the curtains, that it's as though the meat went out of the area of the courtyard and therefore it's disqualified. In Mashman, we don't say that. The Gemara says, maybe that is exactly what's going on. That the carbon became disqualified because the curtains are no longer there, and it's like the psul, the disqualification of Yotze. The Gemara says, Amakra bin Nasa Ol Moed. And the Ol Moed traveled. And so this teaches us, even though it traveled, it's still going to be considered like the Ol Moed, and therefore the meat does not become disqualified. So since we started talking in this context about the altar, the Gemara talks about some other halachos about the altar, and this is some of the most powerful spiritual lines of the tractate. Gemara tells us, Amrav Huna Marav, Mizbeach Shel Shiloh, the altar of Shiloh, Shel Avanim Haya, meaning to say the altar of Shiloh, that there was an altar in Moses' time, and that altar was made out of wood plated with copper, and then there was an altar after they went into the land of Canaan. They set up the Mishkan in Shiloh, and they built an altar there of stones. The Tanya Reb Elazar Yaakov over Avanim, Avanim, Avanim. It says in the Torah 3 times with respect to the altar, the Mizbeach, it says stones. Shalosh Pamim, Echad Shiloh, Echad Shalno, the Givon, Ubeis Olamim. One is the altar of Shiloh was made out of stones. Then the altar of Nov and Givon were traveled after Shiloh. And then after that, the Beit Olamim, which is the Beit HaMikdash, the eternal house. Unlike our houses, which are not eternal, because once the house is gone, the physical structure is gone, it's nothing. But the Beit HaMikdash, the holy sanctuary, even though it's destroyed, it still retains its holiness. So it's called the eternal house. And that there too, the altar is made out of stone. So Masav Ravacha Barami, how could that be that the Mizbeach of Shiloh was different than the Mizbeach of Moshe in the wilderness? How is that even possible? Masav Ravacha Barami, didn't we learn in Seder Olam? It says in the Bryce and Seder Olam, it says, Eish Sheyardam Hashemayim Bimei Moshe, that there was a fire that went down from heaven in the time of Moses, and Lo Nistalka Me'al Mizbeach HaNachoshes. It never departed. It remained on the altar until Ela Bimei Shlomo, until the days of Solomon. I mean, to say it was the same fire that went down onto the altar of Moshe remained and did not depart until it came to the altar of Solomon. And indeed, the altar that was there, that went down in the time of Shlomo, it only departed once the wicked king Menashe came along, who was the son of Chizkiyahu, the king of Yehuda, and he ruled after him, but he was wicked, unlike Chizkiyahu, and he destroyed the altar. And he came along Vasilka and he removed it because he destroyed the altar. Meaning to say, So that's what he did. The Gemara in Yoma Chaf Alpha and Beis tells us that even though Menashe removed the altar, he returned to the altar. Uh, the fire returned, and it was there at least at the end of the time of the first temple, but it wasn't crouching like a lion, but it was rather diminished, like a dog, so to speak, says the Gemara in Yoma. But anyway, we see from here, V'im Isa, and if it's you're correct, that there was a fire, that the altar of Shiloh was made out of stones, whereas the altar of Moshe was made out of wood and copper. If that's the case, Meikaru distolically, it would have departed the second they came into Canaan and built the Mizbeach of Shiloh. So why do you say, why does the price say it lasted until Shiloh, until Shlomo Melech? So this is the question on Rav, who says that the Mizbeach Avanim, the Mizbeach Shel Shiloh is made out of Avanim, made out of stones. So the Gemara says the first answer is that Rav, who says that the Mizbeach of Shiloh is made out of stones, is he has a different Tana to support him. Huda Amar Rabbi Nasan, the Tanya Rabbi Nasan, Omar Mizbeach Shel Shiloh, Shel Nechoshes Haya, Chalul Moei Avanim. So it says there's a different price, so which says that the Mizbeach of Shiloh was made out of copper, and it was hollow and filled with stones. And so therefore, yeah, there is another source that says that the Mizbeach of Shiloh is one that was made by Moshe, where there was no stones, because Rabbi Nosson argues, and he says that they made a new Mizbeach, and Rav holds like Rabbi Nosson. Okay, like he has his own source. Nachum Bar Yitzchak has a different opinion here. He says, "Milo nistalka," it means lo nistalka levatoa. What does it mean? It didn't depart until Shlomo. It means it didn't completely get wiped out, that it was still used. Even though it was different Mizbeach, it was that fire, the original fire of Moses was still used, and it lasted. So what does that mean it was still used? Mahi. The Rabbanan say, Shaviva Have Mishadra. Rabbanan say that the fire of Moses, there was the two altars. There was the altar of Moses, and then there was the altar of Shiloh, the new altar that they built. The fire of Moses was the one that came down from heaven, and that fire remained. And they put the altar next to the altar of Shlomo HaMelech, and the fire of Moses, which was on the altar of Moses, the fire of Hashem, which was on the altar of Moses, was shooting forth sparks that went from Moshe's altar all the way onto Shlomo's altar, and it was helping them bring their offerings. So the symbolism is that the original fire of Moshe was still there, and we only had access to the sparks from it. Rav Papa says, "Ushpiza have nakat v'zimnin hacha v'zimnin hacha." Rav Papa says, no, what it means is that the fire of God was like a guest in different places. Sometimes it was here, sometimes it was there. Sometimes it was on the altar of stones, and that's where they brought their sacrifices. And sometimes it was on the altar of copper or Moshe, and that's when they brought their sacrifices. Tanana Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah in Midos. So the Gemara says, let's still talk some more halachos about the building, about the altar. Kisha'alu b'nei Agola, when the people of the diaspora, i.e. the Jews of Babylon, went up to Israel after the rebuilding of the temple and the second temple, they took the altar which was from the time of the first temple, and they added onto it Arba Amos min Adarom or Arba Amos min Marav. They added on 4 Amos in the south and 4 Amos in the west. So they added on to it. So Kamin Gamma, and it was like the Greek letter gamma, a right angle that they added on the southwest of the altar. My timer, what's the reason why they had to add on? What's the reason why the altar wasn't big enough and they had to add on to it? I'm like Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says, well, what's the reason? Mishum Dulus Sapek. It wasn't big enough. And so therefore they needed to bring incense on it. So I'm like, Abaye, they needed to make offerings, not incense. They needed to make offerings on it. The incense would be in the golden altar. So since they need to make offerings, you need to make it bigger. So Abaye says, Hashta Mikdash Rishon Dichsiv Bey Yehuda v'Yisrael Rabim Kachol Asher Aliyam. Well, about the first temple, it says about the first temple that Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the banks of the sea. There, Sipik, there was sufficient. Mikdash Sheni, the second temple, Kahal Kachad Arba Rebo Lo Stipik. Is it really possible where the second temple, where there was only 42,360 people who went up, and they were certainly not as numerous? How could it be that the altar wasn't big enough? If the altar was big enough during the time of the first temple, then for sure the altar would have been big enough by the time of the second temple. So the Gemara says, Amarle, what's the distinction? Hasam Eish Shel Shamayim Misayatan. In the time of the first temple, yeah, there was many more people bringing their offerings, but the fire of heaven was helping them. So if you have the siyata of Shemayim, you have the help of heaven with the fire, the offerings were consumed very quickly. But Hacha in the second temple, where they had to make it bigger because Ein Eshel Shamayim Mithayasan, because they didn't have the fire of heaven to help them, and so therefore the fire was not as strong, and so therefore it couldn't consume the sacrifices quickly enough. Now, what does it mean that they added on? He says, okay, the first, if there was less people, he doesn't say that he doesn't say the answer of the fire. He gives the second answer why they needed to add it on, because shisin hosifu, they had to include shisin. What are the shisin? The shisin is the name of these deep wells that were in the floor of the courtyard of the temple underneath the altar. And basically, there were these pipes in the altar that went down to these shitin. So here it doesn't mean that they added the pits at the bottom. Here it means that they added pipes in the altar. That at first they used to pour the wine libation, the wine offering, and on Sukkot, the water libation, they would just pour it off the side of the altar, and it would go down to these cavities at the bottom of on the ground underneath the altar. But in the second temple, they made an internal pipe, an internal hole in the altar where it went down. Meikara Savor, Mizbach Adama. At first they said it has to be an altar of earth. Shehu Atum Ba'adama, that it's closed and there's no cavities, it's closed with earth. Well, Basov Savor, at the end they thought, Shtia, the drinking, meaning the libations, Ka'achilo, like the consuming. Just like the consuming is on the altar itself, also the drinking has to be on the altar itself. And so therefore, they said we were not going to pour it onto the floor, but rather we're going to do it through the altar itself, through a pipe in the altar. So what do we do with the verse that says an altar of earth? Hold on one second. Okay, so what does it mean? What does it mean, Mizbeach Hadamah, which in the first temple they said meant that it should be sealed off? It means Shumachuber Ba'adam, it's just attached to the earth. So you have Nanu Lo Gabi Kipim, Lo Gabi Machilo. So you don't build it on domes or tunnels. Amar Rav Yosef. So when we have this answer, this was the answer that was given by this is the answer Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi gave. That Ravin gave in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. So when that happened, the Gemara earlier had brought Rav Yosef's answer that it was that the first temple had the help of the fire. So now Rav Yosef says a different answer because the first answer Rav Yosef gave was that they had to build a bigger altar because the fire didn't help them. But now Rav Yosef says, Lav Hainu Detanya. He says, isn't a true answer, that which we learned in the Brisa. It says in the Brisa that they prepared the altar, meaning to say, it's not that God wasn't helping them. It says Rav Yosef, it's just that in the second temple, they finally understood that they had done it all wrong in the first temple. They didn't have the right measurements. And so the first temple, they didn't think they could add on. And so therefore they didn't. But in the second temple, if they had known the first temple, they would have added on. But in the second temple, they realized that they could, and they understood it. So the verse says, how could they have added on to it? Doesn't it say that David said to Shlomo, Kol b'chtav miyad Hashem ha'yiskil, meaning to say that the whole form of the temple and all its measurements was given to David in writing, and he handed over to Shlomo. So how is it possible that this prophecy was not revealed to him? Elam Rav Yosef Kra Ashkach v'Darish. They found a verse that Shlomo did not understand properly, and they expounded it and even though Shlomo is the smartest man ever, they were able to touch up the pasuk in a way Shlomo didn't understand, because it says, "Vayomer David zeu beis Hashem Okim v'zem mizbeach lo Yisrael." This is the altar of God, and this is the altar of the Oah for Israel. And they expounded that David had a Kabbalah, had a tradition that the place that was appropriate for the altar would be kibayis, like the measurements of the sanctuary itself. Not bayis shishim amos, just like the measurements of the sanctuary are 60 amos. Af mizbeach shishim amos. Also, the altar could be 60 amos. And even though they didn't make the altar that big, because the size of the altar is not essential, and you can make it smaller, nevertheless, they made it bigger by 4 amos on the south and 4 amos the west to make it 32 by 32. But Shlomo didn't know this drasha, and if he had known it, he possibly would have made it bigger. So, okay, this is today's daf. We'll stop here. I'll stop here with the daf, and